Good evening, night owls, and welcome to Whisper Crowley. Have you ever heard the wall speak? The question lingered in the air, unsettling and strange. I had heard it 100 times before in passing conversations, in stories shared over too many beers, in hushed whispers behind closed doors. But this time it felt different. The question wasn't just idle curiosity, it was a plea for understanding. And as I stood in the dim light of the old basement, the walls surrounding me seemed to echo with the remnants of a truth I wasn't sure I was ready to face. My name is Alex. I am just an ordinary guy, or at least I used to be. I work as an architect, spending most of my time surrounded by blueprints, cement dust, and the hum of machines. Nothing special, right? But then, there's the house, the one I've been trying to fix up. The one that has been slowly unraveling my grip on reality. It wasn't supposed to be like this. I had come here to help restore the old mansion, to breathe new life into it, but what I uncovered down here beneath the creaking floorboards, beneath the layer of dust and forgotten time, was something far darker than I had expected. And now I can shake the feeling that it is not just the house that needs fixing. The basement was supposed to be a simple storage area, a place for tools, old furniture, and forgotten boxes. But the deeper I dug into it, the more I realized that there was something hidden beneath the surface. A door. A door that shouldn't have been there. When I found it, half buried in the rubble, I thought it was just another old cellar, maybe even an escape route from an era long gone. But the more I studied it, the more I felt, watched. The door was sealed shut, old rusted nails holding it in place. But it wasn't the physical door that sent a shiver down my spine, it was the sound. At first, I thought it was just the house settling, or wind rattling the foundation. But no, it was something else. Something too deliberate. A whisper. A faint murmur that seemed to come from the other side of the door. I had to know what was behind it. It was a compulsion, an irresistible force that tugged at me. So I worked tirelessly, prying away the nails, and with every scrape of metal against wood, the whispers grew louder. Louder, but somehow softer too, like a voice calling to me from the past, from the dark corners of something I wasn't meant to remember. The door finally creaked open with a long, drawn-out screech, and I stepped into the shadows beyond. The air inside was cold, stale, and heavy with the scent of mildew and decay. But what struck me first were the walls covered in old, peeling wallpaper that had long ago lost its vibrant colors, now muted to shades of gray and brown. And beneath that, beneath the cracks and dirt, I could see it. A faint outline of something that didn't belong. A symbol. A pattern. It was etched into the very fabric of the wall itself, as though it had been there for centuries, waiting to be uncovered. It wasn't just paint or design, it felt alive, like the walls trying to tell me something. I reached out instinctively, my fingers brushing the surface of the wall. And then I heard it. The sound was subtle at first, a rustling, like dry leaves blowing across the floor. But then it intensified, like the scraping of nails against wood. Something or someone was moving in the dark. I froze, my hand still resting against the wall, my heart pounding in my chest. The silence in the basement was deafening now, and yet I could feel the presence of something in the air, something just beyond my reach, just out of sight. My mind raced, trying to find a logical explanation. It had to be the wind, or the house settling, or maybe an animal that had gotten trapped somewhere. But the deeper I looked into the shadows, the more I felt the pull of the unseen force. And then the whispers grew louder, clearer, as though they were coming from all directions at once. He remembers. The words were soft, so soft that they hit me like a hammer to the skull. I stumbled back, shaking my head, trying to push the words out of my mind. I had to leave. I had to get out of this place. But something kept me rooted to the spot. The floor beneath my feet groaned as if the house itself was waking up, shifting, coming to life. The whispers turned into a low, guttural murmur that seemed to come from the very walls themselves. You shouldn't have opened the door. I recoiled. The voice was unmistakable now, its tone harsh and jagged. It wasn't a whisper anymore, it was a warning. But a warning from who? From what? The door I had just opened slammed shut behind me with a violent crash, and the room was plunged into darkness. I scrambled, my hands desperately reaching for anything, trying to find the light, trying to find a way out. My breath came in short gasps, and I could feel my heart racing, each beat like a drum in my ears. And then I heard it. The sound of footsteps. Heavy, deliberate, slow. Someone or something was moving toward me. I backed into the corner, my breath shallow, my skin cold with sweat. My mind screamed at me to run, but I couldn't move. My legs felt like lead, my body frozen in place. The footsteps stopped. The air was thick now, suffocating. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't see. I couldn't hear anything but the pounding of my own heartbeat. And then in the stillness a voice. "You awakened me." I wanted to scream, but the sound wouldn't come. I wanted to run, but my feet wouldn't obey. I wanted to wake up from this nightmare, but it was too real. It was too close. The voice echoed in my mind, reverberating off the walls of the basement, but its source. Where was it coming from? I pressed myself further into the corner, my body trembling, my senses overwhelmed by the dense, oppressive air that seemed to close in on me. My thoughts were racing, but they all led to the same question. What had I just done? What was this? My hand still rested against the wall, as if to somehow ground me, tether me to reality, but the sensation beneath my fingers wasn't just wood and plastic, it was pulsing, faintly, like it was alive. Alive. "You've awakened me." The voice was clear now, chillingly so. It was a deep, gravelly whisper, but it sounded as though it was right beside me, even though I couldn't see a thing. My throat went dry as I strained to hear any sounds, anything that would tell me I wasn't alone. I swallowed hard, the silence becoming a suffocating presence. I wanted to speak, to call out for help, but my mouth felt dry, as if the air had stolen my voice. My heart pounded erratically, and a cold sweat clung to my skin, making the basement feel even colder than it already was. Slowly, I forced myself to look around again. The shadows seemed thicker now, the air heavier. I could still feel the present, as though something unseen was waiting just beyond the edge of my vision. Was it behind me? Or was it in front of me? My mind couldn't settle on a single answer. The whispering grew louder, more frantic, swirling around me like an angry wind. I could hear fragments of sentences, but they were unintelligible, like broken pieces of a puzzle my mind couldn't piece together. It felt like the house itself was breathing, its very bones groaning and creaking with every passing second. UV disturbed what was meant to stay buried. I froze. The voice was louder now, almost as if it was right in front of me, its breath hot against my ear. It sent a wave of nausea over me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and a deep, primal fear settled in my guts. The room felt as though it were closing in, the darkness pressing against me from all sides. In a desperate attempt to break free from the suffocating grip of fear, I forced my legs to move. I took one step back, then another, my feet stumbling over the debris that littered the floor. But the more I tried to move, the more the air around me thickened, as if the very space itself was trying to trap me. It was like I was moving through molasses, every step a struggle, every breath a fight. And then, suddenly, the whispering stopped. For a brief moment, everything was still. My ears rang with the silence, and I dared not breathe too deeply, fearing that I might provoke whatever had been lurking in the shadows. My heart slowed, but not in relief and anticipation. I could feel something watching me, something waiting for me to make a move, to break the stillness. Then a scraping sound, a long, slow drag came from somewhere deeper within the basement. The hairs on my arms stood on end. The sound was so deliberate, so purposeful, as though it was something or someone coming closer. Clink, clink, clink. It was the sound of metal scraping against stone, but it wasn't just random. It was methodical, rhythmic. As if whatever was down there was preparing itself. "Do you feel it now?" The voice came again, this time not just in my ears, but in my mind. It was so intimate, like it was part of me, like it was burrowing deep into the corners of my thoughts. My chest tightened. My legs were shaking so badly I could barely stand. I took another step back, the old wood beneath my feet groaning in protest. My eyes darted around, trying to find the source of the sound. The darkness pressed in so tightly that it felt like I was suffocating. The whispering came again, not from behind me this time, but all around me. UV disturbed me, but I am not alone anymore. I didn't understand. What was speaking? And who else was down here? I wasn't alone, that much was clear. But who else, or what else, was here with me? I wanted to scream, to shout, to run, but I couldn't move. My mind raced through the possibilities. Had I uncovered something? Had the house somehow summoned this thing? My body froze as another noise ripped through the air with a louder sound, like nails dragging across concrete. I turned toward it, my body trembling violently. A figure. A shadow, tall and thin, standing just at the far end of the basement. The dim light from above cast it in jagged silhouettes, but it was unmistakable. It was something standing there, something human-shaped. But it wasn't right. The figure twitched, its movements unnatural, jerky, as though it were struggling to maintain its shape, like something was forcing it to stand. I couldn't breathe. My body was frozen, my eyes fixed on that twitching shadow. You brought me back. The voice was a low hiss now, like something scraping against bone. Now you will join me. The words sent a jolt of panic through my entire body. My hand shook, my throat closed. I had to get out. I couldn't stay. Whatever that was, it wasn't human. It couldn't be. I turned to run, but as I did, the floor beneath me seemed to shift. The house groaned louder, the walls vibrating with a low hum. I could feel the temperature drop, could feel my breath forming little clouds in the air. The darkness seemed to grow, reaching out, wrapping around me like something that had been waiting for me to disturb it. I ran, but no matter how fast I tried to move, no matter how hard I pushed my legs, it felt as though the space was closing in, pressing me into the very earth beneath. The shadow in the corner moved too closer, quicker, far too fast. And then I heard it again. You cannot escape me, Alex. My heart slammed in my chest as the ground trembled beneath my feet. My breath came in ragged gasps as I sprinted through the basement, the darkness now an overwhelming presence around me. My leg burned, my heart pounded in my chest, but no matter how fast I ran, the air seemed to get thicker, heavier. The whispering had grown into a low, guttural hum, like an incantation being chanted from the very walls themselves. You cannot escape me, Alex. The voice. It was closer now. Much closer. The words didn't just echo in my ears, they pressed against my skin, crawling up my spine. My mind screamed at me to move faster, to find a way out. But the space seemed to be shifting. The walls, the floor, everything was warping. The basement, once a familiar space, now felt like a maze of shadows, as if the house itself had become a living, breathing entity intent on trapping me within its depths. I reached the far end of the room where the stairs to the upper floor stood, but when I tried to ascend, the air around me seemed to solidify. My body froze as I felt the overwhelming weight of something behind me, something that wasn't quite human. I turned quickly, my eyes searching the gloom for any sign of movement. And then I saw it. The figure was no longer twitching, it was advancing toward me, its elongated limbs jerking unnaturally as it moved. Its face, or what should have been its face, was hidden in shadow, but I could feel its eyes cold, knowing, and full of malice. It was an entity born of darkness, and it was coming for me. The basement, the air, everything around me had become alive. It was like the house itself had awakened, stretching, breathing, pulling me deeper into its heart. The shadow at the far end of the room grew larger with each step it took. Its form twisted, distorted, flickering in and out of focus, as though reality itself couldn't hold it in place. I stumbled backward, my feet scrambling for traction. My mind raced. How could I get out? I knew that I wasn't going to make it to the stairs. The house had already sealed me in. My escape was nothing more than a fleeting illusion. You were never meant to find it. The voice, now full of anger, echoed through my skull. I could feel it vibrating in my teeth, in my bones, like the very essence of the house was speaking directly into my mind. The words seemed to carry weight, an ancient weight, like a curse centuries in the making. I had come here looking for answers, thinking I was just uncovering a forgotten past, but now it was clear. I had disturbed something far worse than I could have imagined. I couldn't escape. Not physically. Not mentally. Not while the house was alive with this thing. "Why are you running, Alex? You awakened me. You wanted to know." The whispering was now a continuous loop, like a chant, a spell that sought to bind me in place. My mind reeled, my thoughts tumbling over themselves in a frantic rush to comprehend. What did it mean? What had I found in the basement? What had I done? I had come here hoping for answers to the strange memories that had haunted me for years, thinking that maybe if I unearthed the truth, I would finally be free. But now I understood I had awakened something far worse than I could have imagined. I reached into my pocket, my fingers fumbling for my phone. My hands were slick with sweat, and the dim light from the basement only made it harder to focus. When I finally retrieved the device, my heart sank. There was no signal. No way to call for help. "There is no one to save you now, Alex. You belong to me." The words reverberated through the space like a thunderclap, and I felt my knees buckle beneath me. I hit the floor hard, the cold stone digging into my palms. I tried to push myself back up, but my body felt heavy, as though the air itself had become too thick to move through. My vision blurred as I fought for control over my own body. Panic twisted my stomach. I could hear it now, slow, deliberate footsteps, almost rhythmical, approaching me. The figure was close, its form now clearer in the dim light. Its skin was pale, stretched thin over a gaunt frame, and its fingers were long and twisted, ending in sharp claws that scraped against the floor with each step. It was humanoid, but not. There was something wrong about it. The way it moved. The way it existed. It was not alive in the way I understood life. It was something else entirely. Something from before. "I've been waiting a long time for this, Alex." The voice was low and guttural, now coming from the figure itself, its mouth stretching unnaturally wide as it spoke. The creature's face was no longer a shadow, it was a grotesque parody of humanity, with hollow eyes that glowed faintly, a wide mouth full of jagged teeth. I couldn't breathe. My throat was closing, and my thoughts were spiraling into oblivion. It was coming closer. I couldn't move. I couldn't think straight. All I could focus on was the sound of its footsteps, the way they clicked against the floor, closer and closer. The air around me felt wrong, too thick, too alive. I knew it wasn't just the creature in front of me. It was the house itself. The house that had been waiting for someone to find it, to unearth it. And I had done that. I had opened the door to something ancient and hungry, and now it was too late. I squeezed my eyes shut, willing myself to wake up, to find a way out. But the darkness was closing in, suffocating me. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. And then, just as I thought I might lose myself entirely, I heard the faintest sound, like a whispering wind. But this time it was different. "You cannot escape, not yet." And then everything went black. I woke to an eerie silence. The kind of silence that felt too heavy, too deliberate. My body ached as if I'd been dragged through the dirt, and yet when I opened my eyes, I found myself lying on the cold floor of the basement, just where I had fallen. The shadows were no longer dancing around me. The oppressive air had thinned slightly, though it still hung thick with a lingering unease. My mind raced as I struggled to push myself up, but something felt different now. The ground beneath me seemed more solid than it had moments ago, as if the space had shifted, rearranged itself in my absence. I rubbed my eyes, my heart still thudding heavily in my chest. What had happened? Had I blacked out? The whispers had stopped. The house, which had been a claustrophobic, living entity just moments ago, seemed to hold its breath. I tried to steady myself, pushing against the floor, but something caught my eye, something that made my stomach drop. The basement door, the very door that had been sealed shut earlier, was now ajar. It wasn't wide open, but just enough for a sliver of pale light to spill through. A light that shouldn't have been there. I stood up shakily, my legs unsteady as if they hadn't quite recovered from the terror that had taken hold of me. My gaze kept flicking to the door, the small sliver of light that beckoned from beyond. I had no choice but to move forward, my legs carrying me in spite of the rising dread in my guts. As I walked toward the door, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The air around me seemed to hum with a strange energy, almost as if the house itself was alive, breathing with me. The walls creaked and groaned, the floorboards moaned underfoot like a living thing in pain. I reached the door, hesitating for only a moment before I stepped through the threshold. What met me on the other side wasn't the familiar hallway I'd seen earlier. This space, this wasn't part of the house I knew. The walls were warped, the paint peeling and stained with age. A cold, sickly yellow light flickered from a bulb hanging low in the ceiling, casting long, stretching shadows that seemed to sway, breathing with the motion of the air. It felt like the house had been holding something back. Now the dam had broken, and I was walking into its core, the very heart of its darkness. I took a tentative step forward, my footsteps echoing too loudly in the stillness. I was no longer sure if I was walking into the house, or if the house was walking into me. The air was thick with dust, but it wasn't just the usual stale, forgotten scent of an old house. There was something else, something metallic. Blood? Or was it just my mind playing tricks on me again? My eyes scanned the room, searching for anything familiar, anything to anchor me to reality. And then I saw it. A single piece of furniture. A chair. But it wasn't any ordinary chair. It was old, rusted, cracked leather peeling off the frame, the wood scuffed and splintered with the age. What made my blood run cold was the sight of what was draped across it. A coat. But not just any coat. It was my coat. The one I had left in my car before coming into the house. The one I had worn for years, always with me, even when I thought I had forgotten it. But it was here, sitting in the corner of the room, as though waiting for me to find it. I took a cautious step closer, my breath catching in my throat. My hand reached out, trembling as I moved to touch the coat. And then it happened. A sharp, guttural sound echoed from somewhere deeper in the house. A scraping noise. The sound of something heavy being dragged across the floor. I froze. You shouldn't have come here, Alex. The voice. It was back. But it was different this time, closer, clearer, angrier. The words seemed to come from everywhere at once, crawling inside my skull. My skin prickled, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. The chair in front of me creaked ominously, as if it was alive. Something moved in the shadows beyond. The temperature in the room dropped suddenly, and a sickening chill seeped into my bones. It wasn't the house anymore. It wasn't the walls or the floor. It was here. It had followed me. I turned sharply, my eyes darting toward the hallway, where I could just make out the faintest movement. Something dark, something tall, its outline blurred and indistinct. It wasn't human. Not anymore. I could feel it in my bones, the heavy, the natural presence of something ancient and malevolent. I backed away slowly, my heart pounding so loudly in my ears that I couldn't think. My mind screamed at me to run, to escape, but the fear was so paralyzing that my feet refused to move. It is too late for that. The voice was everywhere now, crawling through the walls beneath the floor, in the very air I breathed. It was suffocating me, drowning me in its weight. And then the light flickered, and for a moment I thought I saw its face, distorted, monstrous, eyes wide with hunger. The last thing I remember before everything went dark again was the sound of that low, whispering chant. You cannot escape, not anymore. I don't know how long I was unconscious. Time felt irrelevant, slipping away like sand through my fingers. I woke up again in the same place, the cold, cracked floor of the basement. My head was throbbing, and I could taste the bitter, metallic tang of fear on my tongue. The house felt different now, as though it were watching me, listening to my every breath. I sat up slowly, my vision swimming as the dim light flickered overhead. The room felt smaller than it had before. Or maybe it was just me, maybe I was shrinking inside it, my mind warping the reality around me. The coat was still there, draped across the chair in the corner. I stared at it for a long time, my heart hammering in my chest. What was it doing there? Why did it feel like it was waiting for me? Every instinct in my body told me to leave, to run out of this house and never look back. But my legs wouldn't move. I couldn't move. It wasn't just fear anymore. It was something worse, something that had wrapped its cold fingers around my very thoughts, making them sluggish and distant. The whispers were back too. They swirled through my mind like an insidious storm, impossible to ignore, each word sinking deeper into my soul. It knows you. It knows your name. I clutched my head, trying to block it out. The words echoed, reverberating like a distorted melody that couldn't be silenced. I stood up on shaky legs, feeling as if the house itself was pulling me deeper into its maze. The door that had once been ajar was now completely closed, but there was a faint scratching sound coming from the other side, as if something was dragging itself along the floor. I knew I had to open that door. I had to see it, face it, even if it terrified me. Whatever was behind it, whatever was pulling me closer, I needed to understand. My hands were trembling as I reached for the door handle. The cold metal sent a shiver up my spine, but I couldn't turn back. I couldn't escape. The door creaked open slowly, as if reluctant to reveal its secrets. Beyond it was the hallway, but it too had changed. The walls were darker now, the shadows longer and more twisted, like claws reaching for me. The faint flicker of the overhead light was the only thing that kept the darkness at bay, but even that seemed to be dimming. My breath caught in my throat as I took a step forward. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and I could feel the ground beneath me shifting, almost like the house was breathing with me, alive in a way it hadn't been before. Then, from the shadows, I saw it. A figure tall, thin, and impossibly stretched, its limbs unnaturally long. Its face was a blur, a distortion of features that shifted with every glance. The eyes, though they stayed the same, two hollow sockets, deep and black, like pits of endless darkness. It wasn't a person. It wasn't anything human. I froze. My body refused to move, to scream, to do anything. It was as if time itself had stopped. The creature took a step toward me, and the world around us seemed to bend, to fold in on itself. The air thickened again, and the whispers returned, louder now, a cacophony of voices, all speaking at once. It is too late. You can run from what you've found. A figure reached out, its hands stretching unnaturally long, fingers twitching as if it were savoring the moment. I wanted to scream, to push it away, but I couldn't. My body felt like stone, frozen in place, as the dark entity came closer. Then the ground beneath my feet gave way. I didn't fall, I sank, as if the earth had opened up just for me. The light above me flickered and went out, plunging me into complete darkness. I was no longer in the house. I could feel it, this place, wherever it was something ancient, something old. The air smelled of mold and rot, and the walls seemed to pulse with a sickly rhythm. And then I heard it. A soft whisper, barely audible, but clear enough to pierce the suffocating silence. You are mine now. The voice wasn't just in my head anymore, it was real. It was in the air around me, in the walls, in the very space where I stood. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't. I couldn't move. There was no escape. The house had taken me, and it wasn't letting go. I don't know how long I was there, how long I wandered through that suffocating dark, but I could feel it was watching, waiting. It was feeding on my fear, and I had nothing left to give. Only the whispers remained, growing louder with every passing second. And then, in the dead silence of the dark, I heard something else. A door. A door opening somewhere in the distance, the creak of the hinges so familiar it felt like a memory from another life. But it wasn't the door to the house. It was the door to my past. The past I had tried to bury. I tried to move toward it, to reach for it, but I knew that I would never make it. Because whatever waited for me on the other side, whatever waited for all of us, had no intention of letting me leave. Not alive. Not ever again. I hope you enjoyed the first story. If you did, don't forget to leave a like. But if I didn't do my job well, feel free to give it a thumbs down. Either way, drop a comment and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now, let us continue. Have you ever wondered what it feels like to live in a place that knows your darkest fears? A place that holds your memories in its walls, whispers them back to you when you're most vulnerable. That is what I asked myself when I first stepped into the old house. It had been abandoned for years, but it felt as though it had been waiting for me. The house seemed to breathe, its wooden beams groaning under the weight of history. The windows were covered in grime, but through the dust I could still see the faint outline of the once grand architecture. It was old, yes, but it felt alive, like it was remembering something. I was drawn to it. Something about it called to me, even though I didn't understand why. I had no ties to this place. No family, no history here. I was simply looking for a new start, a fresh chapter. But the moment I walked in, the air felt thick, heavy with the weight of secrets. The front door creaked when I pushed it open, the sound echoing in the empty space. I stepped inside, the floorboards groaning beneath my feet. The house seemed to swallow the noise, leaving only the sound of my breath and the occasional rustle of wind through the broken windows. It was quiet. Too quiet. But there was something else in the silence, something I couldn't place. A feeling of being watched, a sensation that something in the shadows was waiting. I shook it off as nervousness. After all, I was alone. The house was abandoned. There was no reason to feel anything but curiosity. But then the air grew colder. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. It was sudden, the temperature dropping as though someone had opened a door to winter right next to me. My skin prickled with goosebumps. I looked around, but nothing seemed out of place. No draft, no reason for the chill. The house remained still, silent, as it had been moments before. But the cold didn't fade. It lingered, creeping under my skin, settling into my bones. And then I heard it. A soft sound, barely perceptible at first, a whisper. I couldn't make out the words, but it was unmistakable. Like a voice, low and sibilant, murmuring just beyond my reach. I turned, scanning the room, but no one was there. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to move, stretching and pulling at the edges of my vision. I shook my head, trying to shake off the unease that was building in my chest. Just the wind, I muttered to myself. But it wasn't just a wind. The sound grew louder, clearer. The whisper became a voice, faint but unmistakable. I couldn't understand the words, but the tone, cold, distant, almost mocking, sent a chill down my spine. I stepped forward, my feet heavy on the floor as I moved deeper into the house. The hallway stretched up before me, dimly lit by the weak sunlight filtering through the grime on the windows. The walls were covered in peeling wallpaper, faded floral patterns that had long since lost their vibrancy. The place smelled musty, like old paper and decay, but there was something else in the air. Something sour. I didn't know what it was, but I couldn't ignore it. I could feel it, just out of sight, pressing against the edges of my perception. The house was alive. The longer I stayed, the more it felt like the walls were watching me, breathing with me. I felt like a guest in my own skin, as if something inside this place was waiting for me to understand it. The whispers followed me. They didn't stop. They were becoming clearer now, like a conversation just beyond the wall, hidden in the shadows. I pressed my hand to my ear, straining to listen, but the words were lost in the crackle of static. I moved on, my footsteps echoing in the empty space. The house was larger than I had expected, its halls winding in all directions, leading to rooms I hadn't seen. I stepped into one, my heart pounding in my chest. The air was thick here, saturated with something ancient. The dust in the corners was in touch, as if the room hadn't been entered in decades. But there was a table at the center of the room, and a chair, still sitting there as though waiting for someone. I moved closer, my fingers brushing the edge of the table. It was covered in dust, but I noticed something strange. A small, delicate crack in the wood, barely noticeable, yet it felt like a wound. Like the house itself had been scarred. And then the whispering stopped. For a moment, I thought I'd imagined it. The silence returned, almost too sudden, too perfect. But it wasn't the same. The air felt heavier now, pressing down on me. The walls felt closer, the shadows longer. I turned, my heart racing. There, at the edge of the hallway, a figure stood. It was barely visible at first, just a shadow against the wall. But as I stared, the shape became clear. A woman, her face hidden in the folds of her long hair. She was standing still, watching me. I didn't move. I couldn't. There was something wrong about her, something off. The shadows clung to her like a second skin, her presence distorting the air around her. My pulse raced in my throat, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. I should have left then. I should have turned and run. But I didn't. I took a step forward, and she was gone. One moment she was there. The next the hallway was empty. I stood frozen for a long time, unsure if I had truly seen her, or if it had been a trick of the light. But the longer I stood there, the more I felt that something in the house had shifted. It was watching me. It was waiting. The silence had returned, but this time it felt different. It wasn't empty anymore. It was full of things I didn't understand. And I wasn't sure I wanted to. The shadows clung to me as I moved through the house, each corner more oppressive than the last. I couldn't explain it, but the space seemed to shift with me. The walls weren't just walls anymore, they felt like they were alive, bending and breathing around me, closing in with each passing step. I shook my head, trying to dispel the thoughts creeping into my mind. It was nothing. Just a house. An old, forgotten house that had been empty for years. Yet, the air tasted different here. Thick. Heavy. As if something ancient and forgotten was stirring beneath the floorboards. I turned back down the hallway, unsure where to go, or what I was even looking for. My breath echoed around me, bouncing off the walls, and with each breath, I felt more disconnected from myself, like I was no longer in control of my own thoughts. There was a door at the end of the hall, the plain wooden door that seemed to shimmer in the fading light. It didn't stand out. It wasn't special. But somehow it called to me. I took a step forward, my feet heavy on the creaking floorboards. The whispering started again, just like before, but this time the voice wasn't distant. It was closer. Louder. I could almost hear the words now, though they were distorted, like static filling the space between the words. Come closer. You have to remember. I froze, the sound pulling me in, wrapping around my thoughts. I should have turned and run. I should have gotten out of there, but I couldn't. I couldn't move. My legs were rooted to the floor, like something was holding me there, making me listen, making me stay. With a deep breath, I pushed the door open. Inside was nothing but darkness, a thick, impenetrable black that swallowed up the light. The air inside was cold, colder than the rest of the house, and as soon as I stepped in, the door slammed shut behind me. The sound echoed in the dark room, reverberating in my chest. My heart skipped a beat. I reached out, my fingers brushing the walls, expecting to feel the cool, rough surface of water plaster. But instead, my hand met something soft. Something wet. I jerked my hand back, a shiver crawling up my spine. My breath came out in shaky gasps, each one trembling with fear. What was that? What had I touched? I took another step forward, my pulse racing, and the whispering returned. This time, it wasn't just a voice, it was a presence, something I could feel moving in the dark with me. You can escape. I stumbled, my legs trembling beneath me. I was about to turn and flee when I heard it. It sounded so faint at first, it might have been my imagination. But it wasn't. It was a soft, scraping noise, like nails on glass. I froze again, listening, my heart thundering in my chest. The noise was coming closer, moving along the walls, circling me. I backed away, my breath shot, but my feet were tangled in something. A tangle of ropes? No, it was a hair. I reached down, fingers brushing against long, tangled strands of something cold and wet. My stomach churned, and I pulled away, almost stumbling in panic. But there was no escape. The darkness was everywhere. The air felt thick and suffocating. The scraping stopped. And then the silence returned, but it wasn't too peaceful. It was oppressive, like the entire room was holding its breath, waiting for something. Waiting for me. My chest tightened. I was suffocating in the stillness. I needed to leave. I had to leave. But just as I reached for the door, it opened. Slowly. The creak of the hinges sending a sharp jolt of fear through me. And standing in the doorway was the woman. The figure from the hallway. Her hair was wild, covering her face in a thick veil, but I could feel her eyes. Even though I couldn't see them, I could feel them on me. Cold. Unforgiving. She spoke in a voice that wasn't a voice at all. It was more like a whisper that cold under my skin, making my blood run cold. You shouldn't have come here. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run. But I couldn't move. It was like the air itself was holding me still, keeping me locked in place. The woman stepped closer, and with each movement, the shadows around her seemed to grow, wrapping around her like a cloak. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. All I could do was stare, unable to look away. And then, with a sharp intake of breath, the room shifted. The walls warped, stretched like rubber, and the floor beneath my feet seemed to tilt, throwing me off balance. I fell to the ground, my hands scraping against the cold surface. My body trembled, and I heard the faintest laugh, high-pitched sharp, coming from somewhere in the dark. It's all coming back, you know. I looked up at the woman, my heart hammering in my chest. What is this? I wanted to ask, but the words wouldn't come. Her lips parted, and the voice wasn't hers anymore. The voice that spoke was deeper, older, and full of malice. It was a voice that came from somewhere far beneath the earth, from somewhere ancient, lost to time. You belong here now. I shook my head violently, trying to push the words from my mind, but they kept coming, louder now, filling the space. The shadows twisted, taking shape, becoming figures, shapes of things that were not human, things that didn't belong in the world. I was not alone. They were here. And the house was awake. I couldn't breathe. The air was thick with an oppressive weight, like it was pressing down on my chest, suffocating me. The shadows, those shapes that had been nothing but vague outlines in the corner of my mind, were now solid alive. Their eyes gleamed in the darkness, pale and unblinking, watching my every move. I tried to scramble to my feet, but my limbs felt heavy, as though the weight of the room itself was pulling me down. My hands shook as they braced against the cold, wet floor, and every inch of my skin burned with the sensation of something crawling beneath it. The woman in the doorway, it wasn't her anymore. Her face was obscured by a dark veil of hair, but the figure standing there felt wrong. I didn't know who or what she was, but I knew with every fiber of my being that she wasn't human. And whatever these creatures, these shadows were, they were connected to her. I could feel it in my gut. She stepped closer, her footfall silent, though the ground beneath her seemed to quake in response to her presence. With each step she took, the room around me seemed to distort, as though reality itself was bending to her will. You can run, she said, her voice now hollow, like the wind whispering through the cracks of a long-abandoned building. It was soft, yet full of something ancient, something malevolent. The voice whirled in the room, filling every crevice. You can escape. My mind screamed for me to do something, anything, but my body wouldn't obey. It was as if I was trapped in some kind of nightmare, where the very act of trying to move was impossible. The shadows, the figures, surrounded me, closing in on all sides. I could feel their cold presence against my skin, fingers, or claws, or something worse. Their breath was ragged and uneven, yet it sounded like a chorus of whispers, each voice overlapping the next, all demanding that I remember. Remember what? I wanted to shout, but my throat was tight, constricting with fear. My thoughts felt fragmented, like pieces of a shattered glass puzzle that I couldn't put together. Memories flickered in my mind, just out of reach. Faces I should know but couldn't place. Events I was sure had happened, yet the details twisted, bleeding into something wrong, something darker. The woman had reached out a hand, her long, pale fingers brushing the air before me. Her eyes were no longer hidden, and though I couldn't see the details of her face, I felt her gaze sharp, cruel, and knowing. She tilted her head slightly, as if studying me. She knew my thoughts, my fears, my every doubt. She knew more about me than I did. The floor creaked beneath me, and I glanced down, seeing what had been hidden in the shadows, the ropes, the strands of hair I had touched earlier, tangled around my ankles. It wasn't hair. It was something else. The texture was wrong, slimy and cold, and it slithered, pulling me deeper into the floor. My heart hammered in my chest. I tried to pull away, but it felt like my feet were stuck in quicksand. I tugged harder, panicking as the rope saw whatever they were tightened around my legs, pulling me down, dragging me closer to the darkness. "Stop!" I cried, my voice raw. But no one responded. The shadows had swallowed a whole. The woman spoke again, and this time there was something chilling in her tone. This is where it all began, and this is where it will end. I could feel the air around me growing colder, impossibly so. The walls, once solid, now seemed to pulse and undulate like living flesh, pressing in on me from all sides. I looked up, and for the first time I saw it, the thing that had been hiding in the corner of my mind, the thing I couldn't fully remember. It was there in the shadows, shifting and undulating like smoke. A form took shape before my eyes, slowly, painfully, as if it were struggling to manifest. It was humanoid, almost human, but wrong. Its limbs were too long, too thin, and its face was a blur, a swirling mass of eyes, mouths, and twisted features that didn't make sense. But in the depths of that face, there was something I recognized. Something that haunted me. A single word flashed through my mind. Mother. But no, that couldn't be right. It couldn't be. I had to be wrong. This thing wasn't here. No, it wasn't he. Yet it whispered my name. You remember now. I choked back a scream. The air felt like it was thickening around me, suffocating me. Every sound in the room seemed distorted, now muffled, like I was underwater. The shadows continued to move, but they weren't just around me anymore. They were inside me, crawling beneath my skin, whispering in my ears. It was all connected. The room started to spin, and the darkness became alive, pulling me deeper, further away from the reality I had once known. The house was no longer a house. It was a prison, a tomb, and I was trapped. The thing in the corner, no, not her, it moved closer. The closer it came, the more I felt the walls pressing in around me, suffocating, crushing. My chest was tight. The darkness was no longer just around me. It was inside me. My thoughts, my memories twisted, fragmented, were all being consumed by the shadows. And as the thing reached out a hand to touch my face, I realized with absolute horror that I had been wrong all along. The memories I had fought to keep buried, the ones that had seemed like nothing more than a nightmare, were the key to everything. But I didn't want to know. I didn't want to remember. It was too late. The house was awake. And so was I. The touch was ice cold, like the sting of 1,000 needles pressed into my skin. It was so much more than just a hand. It was a presence, an oppressive force that seemed to pour into my very soul, erasing the boundaries between who I was and who I had become. My breath hit shallow and panicked, as I felt the ice-cold fingers trace down my cheek, leaving a burning trail behind. The darkness swelled closer, thick and suffocating, until I couldn't tell if the room was shrinking or if I was simply being pulled into it. The thing was shaped, the form was so close now that I could hear its breath, ragged and wet. It was like the sound of something alive, something ancient crawling through the walls of my mind. Mother, it whispered again, that same word, the one that had no place in this nightmare. But it wasn't her. I refused to let it be her. It can't be. I tried to pull away, but my body wouldn't move. My legs were still tangled in whatever had bound me, the cold, wet ropes that wrapped around me, pulling me further into the abyss. I twisted, my chest heaving with the effort, but the more I struggled, the more the shadows seemed to grow, enveloping me, feeding on my fear. The walls of the room bent in unnatural ways, like they were alive, pulsing with a life of their own, expanding and contracting with each breath. The air became thick, heavy. It was hard to see now. The darkness wasn't just the absence of light, it had substance, way. The air itself seemed to warp, vibrating in low hums, like a distorted frequency, filling the space with a maddening drone that made it impossible to think straight. My thoughts flickered disjointed. The memories, once scattered fragments, began to form an image, a face, a name, but it was all so blurry. The more I tried to grasp onto it, the more it slipped away, like sand through my fingers. "Do you remember?" The voice wasn't just the thing in front of me anymore. It was everywhere. All around me, echoing in my mind, sliding through my thoughts like an invasive toxin. I couldn't focus. The room was spinning. The weight of it, the pressure pressing down on me, was unbearable. The shadows surrounded me, no longer separate entities, but part of the fabric of the world, part of me. "You don't need to remember," they seemed to say. It's already inside you. I wanted to scream, but the sound wouldn't come. The shadows tightened around my throat, squeezing, choking the words before they could form. The walls were alive now, their movements slow, deliberate, like the earth itself was alive, shifting, grinding. I could feel the pulse of the house, its heartbeat, like a drum beneath my feet. The floor seemed to shift, pulling me, dragging me towards something. Something dark. The woman now, the thing took another step forward. I tried to focus on her, but the more I stared, the more my vision blurred. She wasn't moving in any natural way. Her limbs twisted, bent, in angles that should have been impossible. She was growing, or perhaps I was shrinking. Her features seemed to warp and change with every blink, like the world itself couldn't decide what she was. Her eyes, pale and hollow, bore into mine with an intensity that made me feel as though my very soul was being dragged out of me. She smiled as if that was what it was. The skin on her face stretched in ways it shouldn't have, and I saw something dark, like a slit of deep shadow, where her mouth should have been. "I've been waiting for you," she whispered. The words slithered around me, inside me, crawling into my mind like an invasive parasite. "Waiting for you to remember." I shook my head violently. No, I don't remember anything. You are not real, this isn't real." But even as I said the words, the shadows around me seemed to mock me. The walls trembled, the air thickened, and that horrible, crawling feeling in my chest only grew stronger. Something snapped. The shadows surged forward, and the thing it was her, or wasn't reached out, a grotesque, gnarled hand hovering inches from my face. I felt its breath, foul and cold, brushing against my skin, making my hair stand on end. Her eyes burned into mine, and I felt the weight of my own thoughts, the memories that had been buried for so long, flooding back in torrents, too fast, too overwhelming. There was something wrong. Everything was wrong. The house groaned, the beams creaking, as if it were alive, as if it felt my fear. The pulse beneath my feet grew stronger, faster, like the drumbeat of a forgotten nightmare, driving me closer to the breaking point. My heart raced in my chest, but the darkness seemed to press in on all sides, louder and more chaotic with every passing second. And then, just as I thought I might lose myself completely to the madness, I saw it. The corner of the room, the crack in the wall that I hadn't noticed before. There was light, faint, a sliver of something brighter than the crushing blackness surrounding me. A way out. Without thinking, my body moved before my mind could stop it. My arms tore at the ropes. What were they, really? The cold, slick coils slipping from my legs as I pushed myself toward the crack, toward the light. The shadows fought back, swirling around me, whispering my name, but I didn't listen. The air was thick, suffocating, but I kept moving, stumbling toward the crack. The closer I got, the more the shadows seemed to pull back, like they were afraid of the light. I could feel the warmth faint, but real. The crack widened just enough for me to slip through, and I shoved my body through, my shoulders scraping against the jagged edges. I gasped as I fell through the gap, landing hard on the cold, unforgiving floor on the other side. The room I landed in was different. It was familiar. The faint smell of coffee, the soft hum of an old refrigerator. A kitchen. It was my kitchen. but it felt wrong. It felt like a dream, like the room wasn't really there at all. I pulled myself up, my heart still racing, and looked around. The house was silent again, but the whispers, they hadn't stopped. They were in my mind now, and as I stood in the silence, I realized the house hadn't let me escape. The shadows were already inside me. They had never left. I woke up with a start, gasping for breath. My heart pounded in my chest, too fast, too erratic. The room was dimly lit. The same kitchen I found myself in just moments ago was it moments ago. The clock on the wall ticked softly, its hands frozen at 5 minutes to midnight. The silence was almost deafening, pressing down on me like a weight. It had all felt too real, too overwhelming. The shadows, the thing, her eyes, her words. But now, in the cold light of day, I wasn't sure if it had all been a nightmare. I could still feel the remnants of her presence, like cold fingers graze in the back of my mind, but the kitchen was normal. Just a kitchen. The smell of coffee lingered faintly in the air, and the refrigerator hummed a steady, unremarkable tune. There were no shadows moving, no oppressive darkness filling the space. I reached for the cup of coffee on the counter. Had I made that? I couldn't remember. My fingers brushed the ceramic surface, and for a moment it felt as though the very act of touching it was a reminder that I was still here, that everything had to be real. But was it? My reflection in the window above the sink caught my eye. For a moment I didn't recognize myself. My face was pale, drained of color. My eyes were wide, unsettled, wild. There were deep shadows under my eyes that hadn't been there before. I looked like I hadn't slept in days. I hadn't slept. Not really. The kitchen door creaked open. My pulse skipped. I didn't expect anyone. Who would be here? Who else was here? I turned, slowly, to see nothing but the empty doorway leading to the living room. But the air, the silence, it felt wrong. It was as though someone, was just beyond the threshold, watching me. I swallowed hard, trying to push down the fear that called in my stomach. I knew better than to trust my senses now. I deepened to see it before. I closed my eyes, taking a deep breath, trying to regain some semblance of control over my thoughts. But it was hard. Everything felt disjointed, fragmented, like pieces of a puzzle that didn't fit together. I had to remind myself that I was safe. I was in my house. It was just a house. But then I heard it. That whisper again. Mother. The sound crawled into my mind like an insidious spine, winding itself around my thoughts, suffocating them. I couldn't push it away. The whisper was too close. Too real. My body tensed as I turned back to the doorway. The air felt heavier now, thicker, like I was standing at the edge of a cliff, just waiting for something to pull me down. I could hear the faintest of footsteps, too soft to be my own. My breath caught in my throat. Who was there? I asked, my voice shaky, barely above a whisper. There was no answer. I stepped forward, drawn to the doorway as though something in the dark beyond was calling to me. As I crossed the threshold, the floorboards creaked under my weight. The sound echoed too loud, too intrusive, as though the house itself was listening. I paused, standing in the middle of the room, looking around. It was the same living room I had known for years. The couch, the TV, the pictures on the wall. The familiar, comforting details. But it didn't feel right anymore. The wall seemed to stretch outwards, expanding and contracting, just like the house I had been trapped in. Then I saw it. On the coffee table, lying amidst a pile of old newspapers, was the broken piece of jewelry. The same piece I had thrown away in the woods, the same broken, jagged ring that had not been in my hand when I left. I felt my blood run cold as I stepped forward, my fingers trembling as I picked it up. It wasn't a hallucination. I wasn't imagining it. The ring was here, in front of me, in my living room, as if it had never been thrown away. I dropped it instantly, as though it burned my skin. My heart hammered in my chest, a violent beat that seemed to drown out the quiet hum of the house. I stumbled back, unable to look at it anymore. I couldn't process what I was seeing. My mind couldn't make sense of it. This didn't make sense. None of this did. And that's when the voices came. They weren't the whispers from before, not her voice anymore. These were different. Louder. More insistent. A cacophony of voices, all layered on top of one another, overlapping in a chaotic mess. Some of the voices were familiar people I had known, loved ones, friends, but their words twisted into something unrecognizable. The room seemed to spin around me as the voices grew louder, growing in intensity until they became nothing more than a jumbled, incomprehensible roar. I could feel the walls closing in, the suffocating weight of the voices pressing down on me. I staggered back, my hands flying up to my ears, trying to block them out. But they only grew louder, rising in pitch, until I could no longer discern one voice from another. It was as though my mind was being pulled apart, fragmented, broken into pieces by the overwhelming noise. I tried to move, to escape, but I couldn't. I couldn't escape the voices. They followed me, and as I turned to run, I saw her again. The thing. The shadow. She stood in the doorway, watching me with those hollow eyes. And this time, I didn't need to hear her whisper to know what she wanted. I was the one she had been waiting for. I had always been the one. And as the voices continued to scream, as my vision blurred and the room spun into darkness, I realized something. The house had never let me leave. I had never left it. I was still trapped in the shadows. Have you ever wondered what happens when a promise is broken? The question echoed through my mind as I sat in the dimly lit room. The walls felt like they were closing in on me, pressing down with a weight I could barely bear. It was a question I hadn't been able to escape, not for the past few weeks, and certainly not for the past few years. I had never truly understood its significance until now. The house was eerily quiet, save for the hum of the old refrigerator in the corner of the kitchen. There was no sign of life, no warmth in the air, no comforting sound of footsteps, no hint of human presence. I couldn't even remember the last time someone had visited this place. The silence felt like a presence itself, watching, waiting, and it was suffocating me. I sat there, frozen in place, thinking of all the things I had promised. Promises I made long ago, so many years ago that I had long forgotten. Yet, they had a way of resurfacing, always at the most inconvenient times. I could still hear her voice in my head clear as day. I promise I'll never leave you. I let out a shaky breath, trying to push the thought away, but it lingered like an unshakable shadow. It always had. The room had once been full of light and laughter. We had spent hours here, planning, dreaming, and talking about the future. But those days were gone now, buried beneath the weight of unspoken words and unsaid goodbyes. The house had become a ghost of what it once was, much like myself. I ran my hand over the wooden table, the surface rough against my fingers, the years of dust clinging to it as if the house itself was holding on to the past. It was like that everywhere rolled decaying remnants of a time that no longer existed. And yet, it was still here at this place. And so was I. As my fingers traced the grain of the wood, something caught my attention, a faint sound. At first, I thought it was nothing, just the creak of the house settling. But then it came again, this time louder. A footstep. A slow, deliberate step, as if someone were walking around the corner. My heart skipped a beat. I turned quickly, but there was no one there. Just the empty hallway. The sound had stopped as quickly as it had started. I told myself it was just my imagination, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. The air in the room had shifted, as if something unseen had entered. The temperature dropped, and I shivered involuntarily. There was something in the house with me. Something I hadn't been prepared for. I took a hesitant step forward, glancing over my shoulder. The hallway stretched on endlessly, its dark corners hiding secrets I wasn't ready to uncover. But I couldn't ignore the feeling anymore. The weight of the silence, the eerie quiet, had become too much to bear. I walked slowly, the floorboards creaking under my weight, my breath coming in shallow gasps. As I passed the old photographs hanging on the walls, I couldn't help but notice that they were all faded, blurry images of moments long past, frozen in time. The faces were unrecognizable now, the memories they held slipping further away with each passing year. But as I reached the end of the hallway, something stopped me dead in my tracks. The door to the room at the far end of the house was open. I had closed it hours ago when I came in. I was sure of it. And yet, now it stood ajar, as if someone had been in there. I felt my pulse quicken, my mind racing with possibilities. No one had been here, no one could be here. Yet the door was open. My legs moved on their own, pulling me forward, step by hesitant step. When I pushed the door open fully, I was met with nothing but darkness. The room was as empty as it had been before. The only light came from the slivers of moonlight streaming in through the cracks in the blinds. But there was something else. Something strange. The air in the room felt heavier, thick with a presence that I couldn't place. It was suffocating. I felt a cold breeze brush against my neck, and the hair on the back of my arms stood on end. That's when I heard it again, the soft whisper, barely audible at first, but it grew louder with each passing second. You promised. I spun around, my heart pounding in my chest, but there was no one there. Just the shadows, stretching and flickering in the dim light. My mind raced. Was I imagining things? Had the years of isolation finally started to break me? Or was something more sinister at play? I reached for the light switch, but before I could turn it on, the door slammed shut behind me with a deafening bang. The sudden noise sent a jolt of fear through my body, and I staggered back, my hand pressing against the cold wall for support. I was trapped. And the whispers, they were getting louder, more insistent. You promised. I'll never escape. I backed away, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The room felt smaller, the walls closing in around me. The promise, that simple phrase, it was more than just a memory now. It had become something else, a curse. And I couldn't escape it. I couldn't escape the past. And that was when I realized I had never really left. The promises I made, the things I'd promised never to forget, had followed me here. They had always been here. The question that had haunted me for so long echoed again, louder now, as if mocking me. Have you ever wondered what happens when a promise is broken? Because now I knew. The answer was simple. It would never let you go. I couldn't breathe. The wall seemed to close in around me, and I felt the temperature drop even further. My pulse was racing in my ears, drowning out everything else. The whispers were all I could hear now. They were so close, but I couldn't tell where they were coming from. The room felt alive, as though it had shifted in some unnatural way while I was lost in my own panic. I tried to move, but my legs felt heavy, like they were weighed down by something invisible. My chest tightened with every breath I took, and I could almost feel the air itself pressing against me. It was too much. My body screamed for escape, but my mind was caught in a whirlwind of confusion and fear. What was happening to me? I shook my head, desperate to clear my thoughts. No, this is just stress. I've been here too long, alone. I am imagining this, I whispered to myself. But even as I said the words, I could hear the doubt creeping in. Could I really trust my own mind? Hadn't I been hearing things all night? I turned my gaze back to the room, searching for some explanation. The darkness had taken on a new form. Shadows twisted unnaturally along the walls, creeping like living things. The air seemed to pulse with an energy I couldn't explain, like the room itself was breathing, slowly exhaling, as if it was aware of me. And then something moved. At first, it was just a slight movement, almost imperceptible, a flick of something in the corner of my eye. But as I turned my head, my breath caught in my throat. There, in the corner of the room, stood a figure. It wasn't human, not entirely. It had the shape of a person, but it was distorted, the edges of its form shifting, like smoke or fog, constantly changing. I could barely make out its features, but I knew it was staring at me, watching. It was the kind of gaze that made your skin crawl, as if it was peering directly into the deepest parts of your soul. The whispers grew louder, sharper. They weren't just words anymore, they were feelings. Regret, and despair. I could feel them tearing through me, trying to pull apart the threads of my consciousness. "You should have kept your promise," the voice echoed, though there was no mouth to form the words. I froze. My body refused to move, my limbs locked in place as if I were rooted to the floor. The figure did indeed advance, but I could sense its presence growing stronger, closer, the very air around it thick with an oppressive force. "You promised you'd never leave," the voice repeated, this time softer, almost mournful. I stumbled backward, hitting the wall behind me with a thud. The sudden impact shook me out of my stupor, and I finally found the strength to take a step forward. One step, then another. I had to get out of there. I had to escape this thing. But it was too late. As I turned toward the door, it slammed shut again, the force so powerful that the hinges groaned in protest. My breath caught in my throat. I was trapped. The room felt like it was suffocating me. I pressed my back against the cold, unforgiving wall, my hand fumbling for the light switch, but it was no use. The room was swallowed in darkness, save for the flickering shapes of shadows that danced along the edges of my vision. The presence of that thing, the one that had never been there before, was too real. I had to get out. My mind screamed at me to run. I couldn't stay here. I couldn't face whatever this was. But I was no longer sure I could escape. "Why didn't you keep your word?" the voice whispered again. "Why did you leave me?" The words cut through me like a knife. I squeezed my eyes shut trying to block it out, but they lingered, digging deep into my memory. It wasn't just a voice. It was a memory. A person. Someone I had promised, someone I had failed. My hands trembled as I pressed against the door. My heartbeat was deafening in my ears. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. Everything was closing in around me, and I couldn't escape the overwhelming weight of my past. The promises I had made. The promises I had broken. And then the room went silent. No more whispers. No more shadows. But I knew the silence was worse than the sound. It was too quiet. Too empty. And in that silence I could hear the pounding of my own heart like a countdown. Every second was dragging me deeper into the abyss of my own fears, my regrets. I turned back toward the center of the room, where the figure had been. It was gone now, but its presence lingered like a heavy fog in the air. And there, on the floor where it had stood, was something I hadn't seen before. A small, old photograph. It was faded, the edges curling up, but I could make out the faces of two people standing together, smiling at me, and someone I hadn't seen in years. Someone I had once promised never to forget. The promise I had broken. I reached down and picked it up, my fingers trembling as I held it. The photo felt cold in my hand, like it was somehow different from the rest of the world, from everything that had happened since. The smile in the photo seemed so distant now, as if it belonged to someone else, someone I had lost. But the worst part wasn't the photo. It was the writing on the back. "I'll never leave you." I felt a chill run down my spine, and the darkness around me seemed to grow deeper, pressing in harder, tighter. I couldn't breathe. I had promised. And I had broken it. And now, it was coming for me. I stared at the photograph, my fingers shaking as I held it. The words on the back were still burned into my mind, echoing over and over again. "I'll never leave you." The promise I had made and broken. The shadows around me seemed to stretch and shift, calling toward me like hands reaching out, as if the room itself had come alive, responding to the broken words. The photograph was colder now, almost ice-like, despite the warmth of my hand. It felt like a curse. I could still hear the whisper, faint but persistent, "You left me." It lingered in the air, thickening the silence until I could hardly think. My breath was shallow, each exhale fogging up the air in front of me. The room, once a familiar sanctuary, now felt like a prison. I backed away from the spot where the figure had been, my feet stumbling over the old, creaky floorboards. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Not just by the figure, but by something worse, something older, deeper. The whispers weren't just words anymore. They were memories. I turned toward the window, desperate for some sign of normalcy. But even the night outside felt wrong. The moon was hidden behind thick clouds, casting the street below in an eerie, unnatural darkness. The faintest breeze stirred the curtains, but it wasn't enough to break the suffocating stillness inside. Everything was wrong. And then, the photograph. It felt as though it was calling me. I could hear it, now its silent demand. Remember me? I wanted to throw it away, to burn it, to escape. But something inside me, something deep and rooted, refused to let it go. I had to face it. I had to face her. My mind flashed back to the last time I had seen her, the last promise I had made. I had told her that no matter what happened, I would never leave. That we would always be together. But that had been a lie. And now she was gone. I had forgotten her. Or had I? The whispers grew louder again, sharper, piercing my thoughts. You forgot. Suddenly, the door slammed shut with a deafening bang, making me jump. I spun around, heart racing, but there was nothing, no one. Only the oppressive silence. But it wasn't the silence of an empty room. It was something more sinister, as if the room itself was holding its breath, waiting. I dropped the photo, letting it flutter to the floor, and stumbled back toward the door. I had to get out of there. This place, this memory, it wasn't just haunted by the past, it was alive, feeding on my guilt, my fear. I reached for the door handle, my hand slick with sweat. I twisted it. Click. The door was still locked. No. I pulled harder, my pulse roaring in my ears. My fingers were numb as I yanked at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. I turned away, desperate. I could feel the walls closing in, the air heavy with the weight of everything I had ignored for years. That's when I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate. They came from behind me, soft at first, but unmistakable. My breath caught in my throat, my entire body tensing. I wanted to scream, to shout, to run, but I couldn't move. I turned slowly, unable to stop myself. The room, once empty, was now filled with shadows. But these weren't just shadows. They were shapes. Figures. At first, they were indistinct, just dark smudges, but then they sharpened, became clearer. I saw them now, her, but not just her. There were others, faces I didn't recognize, their eyes hollow and searching. And the whispers, they were louder, desperate, like a cacophony of voices. You broke your promise, came the voice again. But this time, it was different. It was no longer mournful. It was angry. I felt the temperature drop again. A cold breeze, unnatural and biting, swept through the room. My skin prickled, every hair on my body standing on end. The figure that had appeared earlier, her was standing in the center of the room now. I could see her clearly. She was the same as the photograph, her dark hair cascading down her shoulders, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and something else. Something darker. But it wasn't just her anymore. The other figures, those I couldn't place, were moving closer. They were circling me, their eyes fixed on me, their faces expressionless, except for the unmistakable judgment I saw in their gazes. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't obey. I was paralyzed, trapped by the weight of my guilt, my regret. Every breath I took felt like it was being ripped from my chest. The whispers were louder now, a chorus of voices screaming at me. You promised. You abandoned us. I closed my eyes, squeezing them shut, hoping it would stop. Hoping they would go away. But when I opened them again, she was standing right in front of me. Her face was inches from mine. Her breath, cold and wet, brushed against my skin. She didn't speak, but her eyes, those eyes told me everything. She wasn't just angry at me. She was hurt. And she was waiting for me to make it right. But I didn't know how. I stepped back, my legs finally obeying, but my mind was still trapped in the past, still drowning in the guilt of promises I couldn't keep. She reached out a hand, her fingers brushing against my arm, sending a jolt of ice through my body. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know what she wanted. But I knew one thing. I couldn't escape. Not now. Not ever. The room seemed to close in around me as I stood frozen, unable to tear my eyes away from her. Her presence was suffocating, as if the very air had thickened with her rage, her pain. Her hand, cold and trembling, hovered just above my skin. I flinched, but I couldn't pull away. I couldn't move. Her eyes, those eyes that once held such warmth, such trust, were now hollow, empty. I could feel the weight of her gaze, trailing into me, demanding answers that I didn't have. Why? Why did I leave? A chill ran down my spine, deeper than any cold could reach. The shadows around us seemed to stretch toward her, as if they were drawn to her anguish, feeding off it. I could see the other figures now more clearly than before. They weren't just faces anymore, they were expressions of torment, of unfinished business. I could feel their collective gaze on me, each one carrying a different memory, a different wound. The air grew colder still, and I heard a faint sound at first, almost like a whisper, but it quickly grew louder, more distinct. A voice, deep and guttural. You didn't keep your word. I recoiled as if struck. The voice wasn't hers, but it came from within the room, as though the very walls were speaking. It was a voice I hadn't heard in years, yet it was unmistakable. My father's voice. A harsh, unforgiving tone that haunted my childhood. The voice of someone who had once held me accountable for every mistake, every broken promise. You couldn't even keep the smallest of promises. The voice echoed again, sending waves of nausea through me. I wanted to scream. I wanted to say something, to beg for forgiveness, to explain myself, but my voice was trapped. My throat was dry, constricted, as though a weight was pressing down on me from all sides. I looked around, but there was no escape. The shadows were pressing in, pulling the edges of the room tighter and tighter, until there was nothing left but them and me. The photograph, the one I had dropped earlier, lay on the floor, face up, taunting me. The edges of the photo seemed to curl as if the paper itself were burning, even though I could see no fire. A faint glow surrounded the image of her smile so pure, so untainted by the years that had passed. My chest tightened. I had promised I would never forget her. And yet, that is exactly what I had done. Why did you leave me? The whisper was louder now, no longer a question, but a demand. The figure in front of me stepped closer, her presence suffocating. I felt as though I was suffocating, drowning in my own guilt. Her hand was inches from me now, and I could feel the coldness radiating off it. Her eyes bored into mine, her expression still unreadable. I reached out, my hand trembling. I didn't know what I was doing, but it was as if my body had betrayed me, pushing me toward her. I closed my eyes, feeling the icy fingers brush against my skin, sending a shock of electricity through my body. The moment her hand made contact, something inside me shifted. The room flickered, the shadows seemed to warp, and I heard a sound that made my heart stop, a low, guttural growl, like an animal in the dark. I opened my eyes, and for a moment everything seemed to go still. The figures, the whispers, the shadows, they were all gone. The room was empty. It was as if nothing had happened at all. The air was warm again, and the oppressive cold had disappeared. But then I felt it. A shift. A disturbance. Behind me, the door that had been locked was now wide open. The hallway beyond was dark, but there was something moving there, something that shouldn't have been. The edges of the shadows stretched into the room, inching closer. And there in the doorway, a figure stood tall, distorted, its features twisted beyond recognition. I took a step back, my body refusing to obey. My mind screamed at me to run, but my legs were rooted to the spot. The figure in the doorway moved closer, shape-shifting, contorting in unnatural ways. I could see its eyes pale, hollow, like two deep pits that seemed to devour the light. The same eyes I had seen before, the same eyes that had haunted my dreams. You can escape, the voice hissed. It wasn't my father's voice anymore. It was something worse, something ancient. I stumbled backward, my breath coming in ragged gasps. My mind was a blur, frantic, desperate. I needed to get out. But the shadows were closing in again, swallowing the light, tightening their grip on the room. You can escape the promises you've broken, the voice repeated, louder this time, vibrating through my bones. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't think, couldn't breathe. My eyes darted around the room looking for anything, any way out. But there was nothing. The door was still open, but I couldn't move toward it. The figure was almost here, its shape growing clearer with each passing second. I looked down at the photograph still on the floor. The image of her, smiling, was now distorted, twisted. Her face was melting, fading, as if the very memory of her was being erased. And in that moment, I knew. There was no escape. The promises I had broken weren't just memories. They were alive. They were haunting me, and they were not going to let me go. The figure stepped forward, and I felt the cold hands of the past reaching out, dragging me back into the darkness. It was too late. I felt the chill of the air bite into my skin as the figure inched closer. Its shape seemed to ripple, as though it existed in multiple dimensions, at once somewhere between solid and ethereal, neither completely here nor completely gone. The low growl from the shadows vibrated through my chest, shaking the very ground beneath me. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body refused to obey. My legs felt heavy, like they were submerged in thick mud, dragging me down. Each step the figure took brought with it an unexplainable pressure in the air, as if the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for something inevitable to unfold. The photograph, still lying on the floor in front of me, seemed to pulse with a sickly glow. My eyes were drawn to it, as if it were the source of this nightmare, the heart of it all. The face in the picture, the face of her was now warped, disfigured. Her smile, once innocent, was twisted into a grimace, and her eyes were empty. Hollow. Dead. Was she still alive? I could feel the figure, its presence behind me now, closer, its breath cold and rancid on the back of my neck. My skin crawled, my mind screaming in denial. This was impossible. This wasn't real. Yet every fiber of my being screamed that it was. The promises, the unspoken guilt, the choices I had made, they were all crashing down on me now. I had been running from this moment for so long, trying to bury it, but now it was here, forcing its way into my life, suffocating me. The guilt wasn't just in my mind anymore, it had taken physical form. I reached out, my hand trembling, trying to steady myself on the nearest piece of furniture chair, old and splintered, its wood creaking under the weight of my touch. I could feel the air thickening with each breath, the pressure growing unbearable. The shadows pressed in, seemingly alive, swirling and twisting, threatening to consume everything in their path. I glanced toward the door. The hallway beyond was still dark, a void of nothingness. My heart pounded. The way out was there, but it might as well have been miles away. The darkness in that hallway, it beckoned. I could hear something faintly moving in there, too. It wasn't just the figure in the room now. There was something else, something that had been waiting, lurking. Had it always been here? I could feel my mind slipping. Was it real? Was it all just a hallucination, a nightmare crafted for my own regrets? I was losing touch with what was real and what wasn't. I needed to focus. I needed to fight. But I didn't know how. I didn't know what to do. I had tried to escape this feeling, this overwhelming sense of dread, but there was no running anymore. I had brought this on myself. The promises I had made, the words I had spoken, the people I had left behind. It was all here pressing in around me, suffocating me. Suddenly, I felt it something cold and sharp, like a needle, pricking at my skin. It wasn't just in my head anymore. The figure, or whatever it was, had reached out and touched me. Its presence was all-encompassing, like it was trying to drag me into its world, a world where the past was alive, breathing, and demanding answers. You thought you could forget, the voice rasped, no longer just a whisper but a booming, echoing command. You thought you could run from this, but you here now, you will never escape what you've done. I recoiled, stumbling back, but it was too late. The figure's hand was on my arm now, freezing cold, sending a jolt of ice through my veins. I could feel the air crackle with energy, a force pulling me in, forcing me to look at it, to face it. And then, for the first time, I saw its face clearly. It wasn't just one face. It was the faces of everyone I had wronged, everyone I had promised to care for, to protect. Their faces were distorted, their expressions twisted in pain, anger, and confusion. They were all staring at me, their eyes wide with betrayal. Why didn't you keep your promise? Each face seemed to ask me the same question, the voices rising in unison, filling the room with a deafening chorus of accusation. I wanted to shut my ears to escape, but the sound reverberated through my skull, making it impossible to escape. I closed my eyes, but it only made it worse. The darkness that filled my vision was deeper, colder than the shadows around me. I could feel the weight of the promises I had broken, each one like a heavy chain around my chest, tightening with every passing second. You cannot outrun your mistakes. I was sinking now, sinking into the darkness. The floor beneath me had disappeared, and I felt as though I were falling into a place I couldn't see but knew was there, waiting. My heart raced in my chest, but I couldn't breathe. The weight of my guilt was unbearable, pressing down on me, crushing me. The faces surrounded me now, their voices no longer just words. They were feelings, emotions pouring into me, drowning me. The regret, sorrow, the anger. It was all mixing together, suffocating me. I couldn't move. I couldn't escape. But then, just as suddenly as it had all begun, the pressure lifted. The darkness receded. The figures were gone. The room was still. Empty. For a moment, I thought I had woken up, but it was all just a dream. But the photograph, now crumpled on the floor, remained, its edges still curling, the face of her still twisted in that grimace of sorrow. I staggered to my feet, gasping for air. But even as I did, I couldn't shake the feeling that the shadows were in tone with me yet. They were still here somewhere, waiting, watching. And the promises I had broken, they were still alive, waiting for me to keep them, or die trying. Oh, you made it to the end of the stories. That means it's the perfect time to subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. And if you haven't already, leave a like and drop a comment. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have a great time relaxing, and good night.